This is Monday, the 3rd of November, 2014, and we are interviewing Arthur Seltzer, who was a technical sergeant in the U.S. Army during the Second World War, and we're going to share experiences during the war and before. Can you tell us something about your growing up in Philadelphia?
Well, I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and my parents moved to Philadelphia when I was about 6 years old. And the reason was that she was from Philly and my father used to travel, and he had a broom factory in Norfolk. But when he came up here, they opened up their own store and so forth. And I grew up in Philadelphia.
How did you get into the Army?
I got into the Army, I was very lucky. I was in my first year at the University of Pittsburgh when I was drafted into the Army. So as everybody who may not know, at that time there was a big draft, and when your number was called, you automatically were in the Army.
Where did you go to basic training?
I went to basic training in Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, and I trained with the 99th Infantry Division. I had taken some training with the Signal Corps in private life, and that's how I got to go to school free. And they said that if you were drafted, they wanted to make sure you stayed in the Signal Corps. But I wound up in the 99th Infantry Division. When the basic training was over, we went on maneuvers. And it was during the night, one night of the maneuvers, when I got a call to report to my company commander. And I was told to pack my suitcase, everything I had, and I was going to Baltimore, Maryland, to go to a very special school to learn how to use radio, telephone, and teletype without wire, which I keep on telling the kids in school today, that was the beginning of the cell phone. Well, the equipment, naturally, the radio itself weighed 65 pounds, and naturally, it was in our trailer. Whenever we were in battle, trailer would be with us, and we could operate the radio because it was all set up to be operated immediately. The only problem we had was, in order to get 40 miles, we had to put up a big antenna. And every time we put up this big antenna, the Germans would zero in on it and the shells would start to come in.
How big was this radio?
I would say the radio was about big, a little larger than the average, what do you call it? You have your computer. If you have a big computer, I would say it was about that size.
About the size of a suitcase? Is that what you're
about the size of a suitcase, yeah. It was heavy to carry, but naturally we didn't have to carry it, only when we went over the side of the ship when we landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day.
When you carried the radio, did you also carry a weapon?
I had a carbine, which was smaller than the rifle, and I also had a pistol, which I carried.
How did you get to England?
We left England up in New York. We left England and New York, and we went overseas on the Queen Elizabeth. We landed in Scotland, and there from Scotland we went into England by train. The Queen Elizabeth was converted into a troop ship. We only received 2 meals a day on the ship because when the troops who were having breakfast, it was time for the second group. The first group was getting ready to have lunch already. So it was pretty rough on the ship, and you only received 2 meals a day. You had breakfast and you had dinner.
Once you were in England, what kind of training did you have at that point?
Well, the basic training was, one, that's where we received our trailers and our vehicles for our equipment to be put into, and naturally we would set it all up, and then we would go out on field maneuvers. Also, at the same time, everybody was under the impression, at least I should say the Germans were under the impression, that the invasion was going to come from Calais, France. Therefore, in England, right across from Calais, we started to build a dummy group of vehicles and all kinds of equipment and soldiers, a lot of people who weren't even dressed as soldiers, running around so that they would believe that's where the invasion was going to come from. By doing that, Hitler moved all of his SS troops up to Calais, France.
In your radio, did you try to use any decoy messaging to confuse the Germans also?
Well, the only messages we used at the time in England was enough to confuse them. It was nothing that we wanted them to know, and we definitely stayed away from that as much as possible. We felt that our group and all the groups that were involved in this invasion knew pretty well what they were going to do.
The invasion was put off once. What happened, what preparation in the days immediately before the 6th of June? What were you doing?
Well, all the training was being given, it was in Bristol, PA at the time. Then we went down to Portsmouth. And Portsmouth is a very big port for the English, and that's where our ship was going to leave from. And there we were given training to go over the side of a ship. Now, when I was told that we were going to take training to go over the side of the ship, I was told to bring my full pack, which weighed about 45 pounds, and they gave us enough K rations to last us for a week because they didn't expect to be able to get to us any quicker. And also they gave us our ammunition and everything else that we were going to need. And that's where I took my first step of going over a makeshift ship, coming down with the radio weighing 45 pounds and the pack weighing about 65.
So you got over 100 pounds weight, and now did you go down on the nets, or how did you?
We went down steps. They were not, it wasn't a net, it was better than a net going over, because they said when you go over the side of the ship, those that go over the side were going to be much better than what the practice we were getting.
How about the crossing the channel? How was that?
Well, as you know, crossing, we were on that ship while we were having all that rain, and that was why the invasion was put off. And in most cases, the invasions are usually backed up, if they're land invasions, by other means. Ours was no backup, because our landing was on the beach at Omaha, and if we got driven off the beach at Omaha, we would be in the water, which would have been the English Channel. We were told that we would go out the front of the landing craft. There's 36 men to a landing craft. When the first landing craft went into Omaha Beach, we got a message back immediately: don't go out the front of the landing craft. The machine guns along the beach are all trained, waiting for the gangplank to go down. Go over the side of the ship on both sides, and then work your way into shore. When I went over, at that time, I had my pack with all my stuff in, my food, and I was carrying the radio, and I had a lot of weight. And I cannot swim, and down I went. I had to make a quick decision, and I knew I couldn't lose the radio. I knew the pack, I could get another one, so I dropped the pack, and I came up to the surface. When I got up, I noticed there was quite a few other people who couldn't swim. We got together and we worked our way into shore. Before we went over the side of the ship, I was attached, by the way, to the 29th Infantry Division, which I was going to be with when I landed on Omaha Beach. And the 29th Infantry was naturally a fighting division. Now, we got word back when the first landing craft landed on Omaha Beach, 80 to 90% of them were either wounded or killed immediately. The machine guns that were at the bottom of the buff, a buff and at that time was a mountain, and there was no roads to get through the buff. In order to get through the buff, you would have to blow a hole into it. So naturally, down at the bottom was all the machine guns. At the top of the buff were the big guns firing down on the boats. And when I went back with my wife on my tour to retrace my steps, where the machine guns are is now a road has been built. And you can go from one end of the road to the other, visiting every one of the landings that was made that day, and just leave your vehicle and walk down to the beach.
Once you're on the beach, how did you get off the beach?
Well, the story was, first of all, as I start to say, when I finally got up to the beach and worked my way up, I had to hide somewhere because you cannot build a foxhole in wet sand. And the best thing was, the wounded from the first landing were being taken back on the vehicles that we came on to cross. The other ones that were dead were left there and would be cleaned up later on. So therefore, we only had one place to hide, and that was behind a dead body. We felt sorry that we had to use them, but it was the only way that we could save our life.
So ultimately you moved off the beach.
Well, what happened, I sent a message to the battleships that were off the shore, and I told them that if we didn't get a hole blown in that buff, we were never going to get off the beach. And also, all the equipment that was waiting out there in the English Channel to come ashore, we weren't going to get our equipment. At that time, I got a call from the commanding officer of the 29th, and he told me, I want you to get on the radio and tell these guys that they got to blow a hole in the buff. I said, I've already done that. He says, good. And all of a sudden, the guns opened up, and a buff was definitely blown in it. If you watch the movies, they don't show it that way. They show a lieutenant or someone running up to a private and telling him, I'll make you a sergeant if you put a bag underneath and blow a hole in the buff.
So naval gunfire
blew the hole in, and later on, the 29th Infantry was blowing up more holes once they got the hole in the buff open that the vehicles could start to go through.
Tell us about what happened once you got off the beach and through the buff and onto the...
Well, once we got off the beach and got ourselves together, things were a little bit better as we were headed towards our next place that we were supposed to go to. Before I got off the beach, I found the sergeant who was in charge of our group, and he told me that only he and I were the only two that survived out of the 36 people. Before we went over the side of the ship, the sergeant in charge of our landing craft came over to me, and he says, all the men in our landing craft, for good luck, are going to sign a dollar bill, and we'd like you to join us. And I said I'd be more than welcome to. And I took out a dollar bill, and I have 29 signatures on that dollar bill now. And I show that dollar bill wherever I speak.
You mentioned before about having to find a place where your radio would be most effective. How'd you do that, and what dangers were
Well, first of all, I knew, one, that we were not going to set the radio up on the beach. We were going to use the portable stuff that we had. But when I did see my vehicle come ashore, I knew that we were going to be in good shape. And the first place we put that up, we would go into a small town, and then we go outside the town to a farm somewhere, and that's where we would put the antenna up. The antenna was roughly about 9 feet up in the air. It was a regular pole with the antenna equipment on the top, so you had to have a big field. The only problem was Once we put that antenna up, the Germans could zero in on us because we were sending signals and they could pick up where we were. So again, in one way it was good to operate the radio, but in the other breath, the bombs coming in were pretty rough at that time.
You had to keep moving.
You had to keep moving, and you couldn't be stationary too long. Again, now as I said before, on the beach, normally in war today, there's always a second program that you can back up on shore and reform and then go ahead again. We could not back up on Omaha Beach because we would be in the water. So we only had one program, and that was to get off Omaha Beach. And the only way was to go forward.
As you moved through Europe, and you had several others, St. Lo, Bastogne, Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Tell us what happened there.
Well, the first place was St. Lo, and when I say St. Lo, we had to take St. Lo for many reasons. Our food and ammunition was coming from way down south, and it took quite a while to get there. But if we could take Antwerp, where the battleships could come in, we could get our ammunition and food right away. So therefore, it was very important that we hold on to that ground, and that's where Hitler decided he would form his group, and that's where the Battle of the Bulge took place. During the Battle of the Bulge, it was so darn cold from snow, we had not received our winter equipment yet, and again, we were cold, and I mean cold. And again, when you wanted to go to the bathroom, the only thing you could do was try to dig a hole in the snow and ice and naturally do the best you could. During the Battle of the Bulge, we were stationed in the forest, and the forest was loaded with trees. I mean trees. And again, to one degree, it was a saving for us, because when the shells would land in the forest, the only problem was, instead of bullets going into you, pieces from the tree would go into your body. And naturally, you had to pull those pieces out. That's where I was thrown into the air, and when it came down, I landed on my back, and I thought I was deaf because I couldn't hear nothing. The medics came running over to me, and they kept on saying to me, you got to go to the hospital. And I kept on telling them I couldn't go, I had to operate the radio equipment. And I told them I would be okay. And they insisted, and I kept on pushing them off. And all of a sudden, I had a ringing in my ear, and my hearing came back. And I told them my hearing came back, and they said, you still should go to the hospital. I said, I'll go later on. And that's where most of the damage was done for me, was at the Battle of the Bulge. From the Battle of the Bulge, after we took Bastogne, and again, that's where the story of nuts came about. Again, the commanding officer from the 101st Airborne was surrounded at the Battle of the Bulge. And the Germans sent him a letter telling him to surrender. And he, in his own wisdom, wrote a note back to him, and he said to the general, whoever was in charge of the German army, that nuts to you. And the German people in the service there who were surrounding us couldn't figure out what that meant. When we came back, my wife and I had to retrace my steps, and we went up to the Ardennes, and we went up to the top where they have a store there. You can find any kind of nut you want to find. They sell them all up there. So that was the only thing that was a little bit funny that happened during that Battle of the Bulge. From there we moved on. We crossed the Rhine River. We came up to a small town, and there's where we got to meet some of the German people, and they were very nice to us. We came up to a concentration camp called Dachau, and we were given strict orders that during the war, if we came across an army war camp, a German war camp, that we were to get our soldiers out and get them back into active duty. That was what we were to do. Well, when we left the town we were in Germany, and we were headed towards the Elbe River, we came across this camp called Dachau concentration camp. That was the first time that any of us knew about concentration camps. And I want to tell you, the first time I saw that, it was enough to turn your stomach. There were people there in no clothes at all, and half of them were starving. And what we did, which was the wrong thing for us to do, we took all the K rations out of our vehicle and start to feed them K rations. Well, what happened, their stomachs were not used to that, and they were throwing up. Naturally, we got a hold of Eisenhower, and we asked him to come to the camp, and which he did. And when he saw that camp, he made the mayor of the town the next day bring all the people up to the camp, and he made them walk around in twos, and he made them pick up the bodies and lie them in the cemetery. And the way they made a cemetery, they took a bulldozer and just level a piece of straight ground, and then they would lay them in there and then cover them up with the dirt. Before they covered them up, they used to put the white stuff on top of them to help decay the body. And that's the way they'd be buried. And he gave everybody, all the soldiers, order, if you see anybody dragging a body, you tell me, and they will be double what they have to do. And he was very strong in that situation. And when I went back on my second trip, my wife and I were walking around the field, and two people, a girl and a fellow, were following us. And my wife and I said, I wonder what they want. So I went up to our agent, who was our travel agent, and I told him, they're following us. Would you find out what they want? He says, they're not following me, they're following you. You find out. So I went over and I says, I noticed you've been following us around all day. Is there something wrong? And he said, yes. He said, the people in that town knew everything that was going on, and the reason they knew was because the SS troopers would come every weekend to get all the information that was going on, and they would stay at my mother's place, and we had a motel and a store, a restaurant there. And they would talk, and all the people who were in the town who were eating in the restaurant heard what was going on. So therefore, if they said they didn't know about it, they were lying, because they did. And that's when my wife and I heard this, was on our trip back. And all the time on the first trip through, I, in my mind, had the feeling they knew what was going on, but there was no way I could definitely say yes, they did. From there, we moved on to meet the Russian army. And as everybody knows, the Russians and the President of the United States had an agreement. And the agreement they had was, since the Russians were fighting with the Germans and were almost wiped out, the Russians were given the privilege to go into Berlin first. And we were to meet the Russians at the Elbe River, which was not too far from the concentration camp that we liberated. When we got to the Elbe River, we came upon the ships that brought the soldiers in, and I believe, without a doubt, there were more women soldiers from Russia than there were men soldiers on that ship. And they were all, without a doubt, they were the best drinkers I ever met. They could drink liquor faster than you could think about it. And they were known as big drinkers, and they were. But it was really great to meet them, because when we met them at the Elbe River, we knew that the war for us was over. And we knew that we had finally survived, which was the worst war that anyone at my age could be in.
How old were you then?
I landed on Omaha Beach when I was 17 years of age. When I came home, I was 20 years old. So you see, I spent quite a few years over there. During the war, there was a German lieutenant who had captured a large amount of our soldiers. And he took them and he said, don't worry, you're all going to be okay, you're going to be in a prison, and nothing's going to happen to you. And they came upon a large field, and when they saw the large field, they were told all to go out into this large field. And all of a sudden, vehicles pulled up with machine guns on them. And there was 150 of our soldiers were machine gunned to death. A few of us were very fortunate, like myself. We were able to be in the back of the group. We ran to the back and hid behind some trees until our soldiers were able to put the machine guns out of order. And at that time, that was probably one of the worst things I can think of at the time that had happened. You know, a lot of other things happened that were bad, but that was something. We were given instructions after that. If you come across any German soldiers and you're taking them back to Army headquarters, and the reason we were always taken back to Army headquarters, we wanted to interrogate them to get as much information as possible. But we were told after that machine gunning that we were to get back as soon as possible. That meant get rid of them, and we did. And that was probably another worst thing that I was faced with during the war. When we came across all these soldiers and all the SS troopers normally had two things they carried with them at all times. One was their Luger German gun, which I believe I showed you. And the other one was a book written by Adolf Hitler called Mein Kampf. And each one carried that with them. And I was able to take off one of the SS troopers the book Mein Kampf that was signed by Adolf Hitler, and also the German Luger, which I showed you, gentlemen. Again, my wife made sure that I put something in it so I couldn't shoot any bullets through it with all our children we had. When the war was over, my commanding officer called me to his office, and he says, you gotta make a decision. I says, I'm finished making decisions. I only have one decision to make, and that is, when am I going home? And he says, it's funny, that's what I want to talk to you about. And he told me that he could transfer me immediately to the 100th Infantry Division that was going home in 1 week. And I said, you do that? He says, wait, you didn't hear the second thing. I says, I don't know what the second thing is. I like the first thing. He says, well, if you stay with us, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a big parade for our group, and you're going to be awarded the Bronze Star. I said to him, you transfer me to the 100th Division, and you send the Bronze Star by mail to my house. And I was transferred, and I went home. And later on, as life went on, and I got married and so forth, I was interviewed by the newspaper out of New York, and I told them all about the gun and also the, book that I had. So again, I show it to the kids in school. I do not show the gun, even though I can't shoot it, but I feel that they don't have to know about guns.
When you came home, how was the transition to civilian life?
Well, when I came home, I had a situation. First of all, I was glad to be home. And when I came home, I only had my Army clothes. And my mother said to me, she got rid of all of my civilian clothes because, you know, I was away from home almost 5 years. So she said, you got to go downtown and get some clothes, and you got to go to Chestnut and Walnut Street. And she says, now you remember, that is 2 blocks south of Market Street. Now remember, not north-south. I said, Mom, I know all about it. I still remember. Well, lo and behold, I got off at the wrong stop, and I'm walking down the street for a minute, and I see all electronic places. And I said, this can't be the place I'm supposed to be. And I realized, holy guys, I looked up at the sign, it says Arch Street. And as I look down the street, I see a man coming out of the store where there's flags and all, and eating a sandwich. So I went up to him and said, what's going on? He says, they're having a grand opening here. He says, go in, they're giving out sandwiches and soda and all, you know, and I had on civilian clothes. He didn't know I was even a soldier or anything. So I went in. And as I went in, and I got a sandwich and a soda, and I'm eating, I looked down on the floor, and across the whole bottom of the floor is all this radio equipment I operated during the war. And I said to the man, where did you get that equipment? He says, I bought it in surplus. Why? I said, I operated this during the war. Meanwhile, a customer came in, and he came over to me, and he said to me, can you tell me about that radio equipment? I said, yeah, I operated during the war. The only problem with it, you have to put a big antenna high in the sky. He says, I have it because I'm a radio amateur. So I said, oh, then you know what to do. He says, yeah. He said, well, good, I'll take one. I said, I don't work here. I just dropped in to get a sandwich and a soda. So I said, well, go over to the counter and somebody will wait on you. They'll be glad to take your money. Well, after that, the man came up to me and he started to talk to me, and he said to me, you're going to come to work for me. And he says, you'll enjoy working here. I says, not me. I enjoy what I'm doing right now. He says, what are you doing? I says, nothing. I says, I'm getting $52, was it $22 for 52 weeks for doing nothing. He said, well, I'm going to pay you more. So anyway, make a long story short, I come home and I said to my father, boy, did you raise a dumb son? He says, now what did you do? I said, I'm getting $22 a week for doing nothing. I took a job for $25 a week, and I got to work on Saturdays also. And my father said, you did the right thing. And I did. I was with this company. That was the only company I ever worked for. And when my wife and I were decided to retire, they gave me, I had a Lincoln Continental, and they gave my wife and I a cruise for 2 weeks. So you couldn't ask for anything better. I am still friendly with the daughter and the son-in-law who now still run the company.
And you went to tell us about you going to school and Temple University.
Well, I decided that I was going to go back to college, you know, and I wanted to go to Florida. And I told my mother and father I was going to Florida. And they were really upset because I was away from home. And they said, you mean to say that's the only school you know of? I said, it's not that I know about it. I said, it's what I've been told about it. And I said, they have a lot of rich Jewish girls down there. And I said, I'm going down to find the richest girl they have there. And I said, and we're going to get married. I'm going to bring her from Florida up here. Well, to make a long story short, it never happened. The way I met my wife was, I loved to play tennis. In high school, I played football, basketball, and tennis. And I enjoyed tennis the most. And I was playing tennis near where I lived, and my brother also played tennis, but he worked downtown somewhere, I forgot where it was, and he met these girls, and they were twins, and their father owned the ice arena in Philadelphia. And he says, why don't you make a date with one of the twins? Which I did. And we were having a good time and all. And I said to her, I said, how about your sister? I have a friend that he would like to meet a girl too. So we went out, both of us, with the two twins, and we went to the Mastbaum Theater in Philly, which at that time was the biggest theater in Philadelphia. And as I'm coming out, we were sitting downstairs, I see Mildred coming down the steps with my friend who lived on the same street with me. So I walked over to him with my date, and I introduced her and so forth, and we got to meet everybody. And then we finally left. The next morning, I called my friend, and I said to him, boy, you were out with a very nice girl. He says, yes, I was, but he says, if you want, I'll give you her number. I said, well, what's wrong with her that you want to give me her number? He says, there's nothing. She lives in Camden, and I don't have a car. I said, oh, that's great. Give me the number. So I called her up, and we got to talking, and I made a date. And when I hung up, I realized I don't have a car. But my father had just gotten his Oldsmobile, and cars were hard to get. And my brother owned that car, not my father. My brother was always driving it. And I went up to him one day and I said to him, after I made a date with Mildred, I said, I don't care where you're going or how you're going, but you're going by bus or trolley, because I'm going to Camden and I'm taking the car. And I went over and took Mildred on the date.
What year was that?
47, I think.
What was it, babe?
1947.
1947.
So, that's a good track record.
That's right.
Well, we've been married now. We'll be married 66 years come January.
Children?
We have 2 girls and a boy. We have
3 grandchildren.
3 great-grandchildren. 3 grandchildren first.
They're all
And
married.
they're all married with 3 great-grandchildren,
With the 4th on the way.
with a 4th on the way. And my daughter, Sharon, who's the oldest, she had a girl and a boy, and they could not be separated. The girl is the oldest, but the boy got married first. And he was a fantastic soccer player. And he got to go to Germany as a soccer player. The coach took him from Cherry Hill East High School to show him how to really play soccer. So anyway, make a long story short, Mildred and I, we've been married, it will be 66 years. So she said, well, when it was time to get married, she said, when do you want to get married? I said, I really don't know, I'll think about it. So, and then she told me, by the way, we can't get married till you ask my father for my hand in marriage. And that's what the Jewish people, I don't know what they do now or what you people do, but I went to meet her father, and they decided to go out, her mother and her, to get some ice cream. So I walked in, and his name was Mr. Small, because Mildred's name was Small. And I said, Mr. Small, I have a very important question to ask you. He says, well, I'll try to answer to my best ability. I said, well, I appreciate that. I said, as you know, Mildred and I have been going study for a long time, and I would like to ask you for a hand in marriage. And he looks at me. He says, pardon me? I said, I would like to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. He says, no way, my son. I said, pardon me? He said, did you say no way? He says, I said, no way. I said, well, is there something wrong with me? Please tell me, I'll try to correct it. He says, you're perfect. You don't have to correct anything. The only thing you have is you cannot have her hand in marriage. You got to take the whole body. I'll never forget that. When he said that, just then, Mildred, the mother, walked in, and everybody busted out laughing. So, you know, at the engagement party, I told this story about it. I was not allowed to have her in. I had to take the whole body.
You mentioned that you left Europe to come home, and they had offered you were supposed to get the Bronze Star. How did you actually get it?
Well, that's what I was going to tell you. We had to go to Maryland to a bar mitzvah, I think. A bar mitzvah. That's when a boy's 13 gets married. Gets confirmed.
Becomes a man.
Yeah, became a man. So we come back, and we had the telephone in our apartment, and no, we were still in Woodcrest, in Woodcrest. And I said, Mildred, you won't believe, we have about 72 telephone calls. I says, I can't understand what the heck is on. Well, I forgot at that time, Fox News interviewed me, and they had come to our home to take pictures and all, and they were supposed to bring the film down to Philadelphia, to Woodcrest, and my kids were supposed to pick it up. So I said to Mildred, Jesus, if these people took the time to call me, we should call them back. So I said, tomorrow we'll sit down at one phone, and I'll sit at another phone, and we'll start the call. So she says, if that's what you want to do, we'll do it. So the next morning, we're sitting in the office, and I keep on thinking it was here, but you keep on saying
It was here.
Oh, what? That was here then. And we were sitting here, and I said to Mildred, we got to make the telephone calls. So she says, well, get the paper and so forth. And the phone rings. And the guy says, is this Arthur Seltzer? I says, yes, this is Arthur Seltzer. Who am I speaking to? He says, pardon me, are you standing at attention? And he says, no, I'm not standing at attention. Why would I be standing at attention? I'm sitting on the sofa with my wife. There's no reason for me to be standing at attention. He says, I beg your pardon, young fella. He says, when you speak to your company commander, I says, holy God, this is Colonel Rice? Did I get the name right too? I says, this is Colonel Rice? He says, I beg your pardon, this is Brigadier Harold Rice. That was his name, Harold Rice. And we talked, and we've been in contact ever since. He lives in California, which I said to you last week, I got to give him a call, see if he's still alive. And he said, by the way, did you get your Bronze Star? And I said, no. He said, well, I'm going to write you a letter, and you give it to your senator, and he'll get it to Washington, and they'll have that thing for you. And at that time, John Adler was our congressman. So I called up John Adler because I was very friendly with him, and he did a lot of speaking and helping us with the Jewish War veterans. So he started it, and then he passed away. And I get a call from the guy who took over, John Runyon, and the secretary called, and she says, there's a lot of paperwork we're cleaning up from John Adler's piles, and there's one about what do you call it? Bronze Star. Do you still want to get it? I said, yes, I want to get it. So she says, okay, we'll get it for you, but you got to get, it won't come directly to you. It's going to come to Washington. I says, I don't care. I'll go to Washington. She says, you won't have to come to Washington. Meanwhile, we had gone to the hospital. My first grandson was born. And I was so excited about that I forgot about everything. I get a call. We had come back from the hospital. That's where I was. And I call my granddaughter, Elise. Was it Elise I called? And I told her about the Bronze Star. And she says, well, I'll go and get it for you, Grandpop. I said, no, I don't think so. So I said, I'll call the lady at John Adler's office, whoever took over his job. And maybe they'll... So I called and I said, I hear my Bronze Star's here. She says, no, it's not here, but you're getting your Bronze Star. I said, where's that? She says, in Fort Dix. Oh, I said, that's fine, I'll go get it. She says, you can't get it. At that time, we were running all these programs for the soldiers who were going overseas. We were running a Thanksgiving program for them. And I was able to get a hold of Colonel O'Dell.
Yeah. I know him.
And he will he'll get the Bronze Star and present it to you at one of our fairs. And I'm going to show you what they wrote on it.
Oh.
So anyway, that's how I got the Bronze Star.
Good.
And it was presented to me at one of our Thanksgiving, and I had my whole family there and so forth. And he came special, and he wears 3 Bronze Stars himself. And he presented it to me. So that's the story of the Bronze Star.
Your work with the Jewish war veterans.
Go ahead.
Okay. You held many positions.
Well, number one, I was a post commander of the Jewish war veterans, but I also was a state commander. And that's the highest rank of the Jewish war veterans you can get, unless you want to go on to Washington and become a full-fledged national commander. Again, I did not want to do it. It took me away from my home too much. I was away enough. I thought being a state commander was fine for me, and that's what I wound up being, a state commander. I still am with the Jewish war veterans. We do a lot of good work, but I don't do as much as I did before. And the reason being, if we're getting older, what we have done, we have gone out to all the schools to see if we can get younger people to join it. And also, we have gone to Washington, and we got permission from Washington that we're allowed to bring our own children into the field. But what we have concentrated on mostly is getting high school students to join the veterans. And believe me, they're doing a great job for us.
Let me ask you this is the final question. Let me precede it. My background is Air Force, and I flew with many World War II aviators, and I remember one time, primarily this was training Air Force reservists, and I remember flying once, and we were talking about the experiences of the aviators who flew over Germany, and a friend of mine brought up what I thought was a very important point. He's pointed at one of our best pilots in the organization, and he was a lieutenant colonel. His name was Morty Fiedler. And this friend of mine said, you know, you really have to respect Morty Fiedler and Freddie Handelsman, because these people, if they were shot down and being Jewish, they're, yeah. Did you know, as you were working your way in very hazardous conditions, going across by foot, did that ever, you know, did that come across your mind?
Well, let me tell you something. First of all, my brother was in the Air Force in England when I was in the Army too, and he flew B-24 bombers. He didn't fly, but he prepared what pilots would be flying the mission that day, which was worse than actually flying. The reason being is you're picking 24 pilots to fly 24 planes, and they may be going to their death. So it's a rough job. So anyway, in fact, my brother, when I first got to England, and I just came from Scotland down to England, in the northern part, he flew in to meet me there. And I said, they'll never get that B-24 bomber out of there. And they did get it out. But anyway, as I said before, we had the highest respect for him, and it was very important for the Air Force, because without them, we'd have never won the war. That's my thinking.
No, we never would have won the war without you going across the ground.
Well, both people had their job to do. And what happened was, as they flew across, and the B-24 and their bombers. And there was a small town, I'll give you the name of it. They bombed that town. One day we owned it, one day the Germans owned it. The communications was not good, and the Air Force did not know that we owned that town that day, and they bombed it. And that's when 6 of our soldiers were killed by our own planes. That's the only time that when I could ever find that something went done wrong. And they didn't do it on purpose, they didn't know. And that's why communications had to be better. And that when I was overseas, when the war was all over, and my brother was still in England, he came over to see me. And I told them about the incident, which they all knew about. And they said, how did the soldiers on the ground take it? And I said, we took it knowing that it was not done intentionally. You didn't know that we had taken it, because one day the Germans owned it, one day we owned it. And I took Mildred to that town to show her to the town. And it's all woods on both sides, and you got to walk through the woods before you get to the town. So it's hard. But that was the only experience. But mostly all the soldiers and that I know of always were looking forward to seeing bombers up there. During the Battle of the Bulge, we would pray that the weather would clear so we could see bombers up there, because that was really when it was bad. So again, you know, everybody had a job to do, and everybody did their job to their best ability. And those who couldn't do a job were moved to a lower job wherever they needed them. And that's how it went. So I think did I answer what you want to hear?
As John Wayne would say, you done good.
Arthur Seltzer, survivor of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, and involved in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his bravery in World War II, including what he calls the longest day of my life, June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion at Omaha Beach on the Normandy coast of France. Arthur Seltzer, a former commander and now member of the Jewish War Veterans in New Jersey, exemplifies the courage and honor of American servicemen during World War II. God bless Arthur and his family, and God bless the United States of America.